Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Streaming Alchemy. I'm John Mahoney, and on today's show, we're going to take a look at part two of our foundational framework that we're putting together to work with vMix. And in this part, we're going to look at handling the question component. Last part, with part one, we looked at handling responses from an audience as they were responding to questions. Now we're actually layering the question part with that. So these two pieces together now will form the sort of core of what we need to do to finish it up with sort of the tallying of results and answers and leaderboards and things like that. But this gives us that next phase here. But before we get into that, I'd like to invite everybody, please, if you have any questions, any comments as we go along, please just share them in the comment section of whatever platform you're viewing on. Also, if you'd like to join us live on air, we do have the URL available in the show notes and here on screen. So if you'd like to join us, somebody from the studio can get you on board. Okay, let's get started. So if you remember last week, the model we were using to handle this quizzing foundational framework is basically we're using the comments inside of a live stream, the comments that you would get back as a streamer. And we're using that to let people respond. And the way we're leveraging that is we're using vMix Social, which provides a foundation for pulling that in. And we're adding in a title, a social title, which makes that information now available to scripting. And that's everything we covered in part one, but that's how we're handling that component. For this, we're actually taking the question piece of this and we're loading questions in via a file and validating that file and the questions in them. And then we're handling that during the show, letting you select a question and present that question to an audience. So let me show you what that would look like here. So here is basically an output on the right-hand side, which would be your normal camera in your studio. And here on the Stream Deck, I have all the controls that I would want to use for production. So this allows me to display a title overlay, which will basically show questions and responses on screen for the viewers. This row lets me select a question, and this row, like before, lets me control what the script is going to be doing next. So let me give you an example. If I select a question, so let's select question 3 here. So I just select that, and I want to say, show that title on air. So this is a question with 4 multiple choice answers. If I want to allow the audience to start to respond, I can say, push this title up into a response area. And then when I say show response, you'll now see everybody that's responding showing up below the question. You're not seeing their responses. You're just seeing that they did respond. So this is to encourage that audience participation by letting them see other people do things to make them feel part of that community there. So the next piece, when we have this in, is I can go and say, okay, set this title, which basically closes the question. So we're not going to process any more responses. And at that point, I can say, okay, this is everybody that responds. So let's see what everybody came back with. So I can hit show the responses. And now, we clean this up a little bit from what we had last week. And this is now showing the question, the details of each response associated with a hash letter A to D. And when I click the show the result, we now will paint in what everybody that responded, what their response was. So this gives us a great way to engage with the audience. And if you see, the workflow is really, really simple. When I'm done with this question, what I can do is say, I will pull that title out, whatever it was, and then you'll see here I have a reset button. And what this will do is it resets all of the guest responses to say, okay, everybody starts with a clean slate. When I present the next question, I'll read all of your new responses. So we press that, and that actually flushes everything out. So this is going through, clearing out all the titles and anything we may have used for this. So that is basically what I'm going to be going through here today. So before I do that, I just want to jump in. We have Pino came in and he just sent us an hello. So Pino, thank you very much for joining us here today. I appreciate you chiming in to say hello. So now that we've had a sense of the overview, there's a couple of things I want to talk about that we're doing with the code. So the first is that in addition to adding new code, we really reorganized all the code we did from last week. As you know, as you start to develop more complicated scripts that have more moving parts and more parts that you are planning to reuse in the future, having those things better organized is going to make debugging the current project you're doing much simpler, but it's also going to make future projects simpler because you'll now have these basically a toolkit. And that's really what we started here today. So let me break this down a bit. We took all of the functions that were letting us call vMix, general functions for calling vMix, getting and setting dynamic values, reading the vMix XML and converting that to a JSON object, updating titles, so the ability to go in there and send titles updates, things like that. We actually took and packaged that into a single, we'll call a module called vMix handler that has all of our scripts for that. And then we export those, each of those functions that we're going to use, we export those out so we can use them then in other modules that we're putting together. And so that's the first example. We did that with vMix. We did this for general things. So things that I said we keep using our own sleep function because there isn't one there. We have something we added here to read JSON files. So that's in sort of a general functions bucket. And we put that as its own module. And then we have a module we did specifically for this package, which is called question handler. And what that will do is that will do all the things you need when you want to read a question and validate that the text file you read with the question details, that everything's good there. So we put that as a separate module. And then we just have our main module that's going to run, which now we call Quiz System Part 2. So that's where that will be. So, but before we jump into the code, let's look at the JSON file with all of the questions that we have in it. So the file is pretty simple. We have one thing called question details, which is our main sort of in name value pairs is a main named object. And in there, we have effectively an array of all of the questions that we want to ask. And each one of those questions comes in as the text of the question, the possible responses, the one associated with hash A all the way to hash D, and we also indicate what the correct response is. So for a show today, we can set all this up, but we could just go and edit this file or create a totally different file name and just save that and work through all of this to go through and set up different questions. And in this case, we have, I think, like 6 questions that we set up here. And if I wanted to add questions or take questions away, that would just be a simple matter of editing this file. So that's really where we start. So this is going to be the file we're using for what we're doing here today. So the next piece is the general functions. And that's what I mentioned. So we put our sleep in here. We also did something to just load JSON. It's a very common requirement in a lot of the types of production scripts we're going to want to do. So having something where you could just say, take this file and return it back to me as a JSON object that I can use in my code is really handy. And so we just basically did this as a very simple set of files. And we plan to add to this as we go forward and find other things that are generally useful to us. But you'll notice now, because I mentioned, since we're separating this in from just being one large file like we had last week into these different file modules with different functionality, we actually have to export these. So what we're doing is we're coming and saying, for these two things, we have two functions in here, one called sleep and the other called load JSON file. So what we're saying is, I want you, as when you load this module, to say, I want to export two functions in here, the sleep function and the load JSON file. And we're basically, I could put any name in here that I wanted. So I could, have, sleep away. And all I'm saying is take whatever this thing that is exported that I'll use externally and assign this function here in this module to it. And we do this across multiple, each one of these things. But that's how we have this set up here. And, for doing things, this is just basic file system stuff. So we take in the file path, open the file, do all the error checking we need if there's anything wrong, but then just load the file contents. If it all looks good, we return it as a JSON object. And then we can use it just like any other JSON object in our code. So that's what we're doing with the general functions. The next piece that we put together here is a question handler. So the question handler actually is going to take and read our question file and do certain things to make sure everything is good. So we start, and if you'll notice, this is the counterpart to what we did with the module exports. I now come back and say constant general. That's going to be sort of the object I use. And I require general functions. And we've used this before with things like for the file system or JSON parsing, other things. Now we've just created our own module to do this. So this is going to let all of those general functions we exported in the other module, it's going to let us access them all here. And so this is going to be really, really handy for us. And so now inside the question handler module, we are just coming in and we will do the load question. And we have a lot of stuff. It's not obvious when you think about it. It's like, yeah, just grab the question. But because this is an external file, we have to make sure that whatever was added there doesn't have any errors or bugs that could cause the program to hiccup or crash or anything else. So when we go through here, we're first doing things to say, do we have a question index? Because part of what you're getting is saying, what's the file path? So where is this file? But which question in the file do I actually want to get? So do I have an index? So we do things like validate, do I have a valid number there? Or is it undefined or something like that? In which case we throw up an error and return null. We also then, if there is a question number and that's all good, we go in and we're checking to say, okay, let's load the JSON file. And now we have to make sure, did the file actually load? Was everything okay there? Did we find a file there? And again, if not, we return no, but otherwise we keep going. And now we're just getting into detail. We're checking, is the question that was being asked for, is it outside the range of the number of questions that are in this file? So basic stuff, but that just makes sure that we don't do anything bad with what we're trying to return. So just an extra check there. And then if we have a good question number for the file, then we're going saying, do we have the question text? Do we have the number of potential responses or all of those elements there? And you can see we're just doing these tests. And if you look, this is just coming back with using this object to say the desired question.question text. So we do that dot responses, dot correct. All these things are how we access it. So we have all that going on inside of this module. And once we've validated all of these things, we now just return that question, the one that was requested, as a JSON object. And we send that back to our main loop, which we will get to in a moment. So the next thing is our vMix handler. And again, there's no really new functionality here. This is everything that we covered in part 1. But inside here, this is just the functionality that we normally use when we go into vMix. So this lets us get the things for the vMix XML, which we're using all the time, and we return that as JSON. And this is everything we did last time. We have stuff to get the dynamic values, and we also have functionality to set the dynamic values. And again, these were all done last week, so we covered them. We've just now broken them out into a separate module. This is also, and it answers the title. It lets us blank stuff out that we're generally going to use in titles, so we can initialize the titles and make sure everything is clean and ready for a title without having things we don't want to show. And so this is all set up in there. And then the other one is we have read social media title. This could be something if we want to do something with audience responses. This will simply let you specify a title that is a social media title inside of vMix and pull all those social elements out of that so we can use this. And again, it's just a good function to have in our sort of catalog of functionality here. And this is, again, other things to update titles, to init titles, to update, this is to update the answers title. So we have that set up and we'll do that. So some of the stuff may be a little too specific for a generalized vMix module. So we may split this again a little further, but the same template that we talked about is useful here as we go through all this stuff. And all of this will be put up in our GitHub repository. So you'll be able to download and play with all of this. So don't worry if you can't follow everything as I'm doing it here on screen. But we have all these functions in here. And at the very end, basically, we are exporting all of these. And this is exactly what we did before. So you could picture as you mature the code base we're using here, that you could say, what are all the things I'd normally want to do inside of vMix? I want to be able to find the input number for an input with a certain title. I want to be able to change the video source being routed to different outputs. All that stuff can start to be baked in here. And then they just become simple function calls in your code. And this, the important piece here, and it's part of what you'll see. When I scroll through all this stuff, there's just a lot of detail in here. And this detail isn't really about the general logic. It's about everything under that logic that you need to get something done. So by having these things in modules, when you write the actual main code stream, the logic becomes a lot clearer and a lot simpler to manage. So that's a big piece to breaking it up this way. So let's jump now into the quiz system. Actually, let me take a moment. We have somebody else join us, Bill Mew. So Bill, from the UK, thank you, Bill, for joining us. It's good to see you again. Okay, so let's jump into the quiz system for what we're doing with part 2. And let me scroll up to the top. I guess I was playing around in here right before the show. So everything we've done here is effectively pretty much a mirror of what we did before, except we just split some of the functionality into modules. And as I said, this is where we load the things. So this is where we're loading vMix handler, question handle in the general. So we talked about that. And now we've added a few more variables, constants in here for where certain titles are, for where the questions file is that we're going to be using, and also for the vMix URL. And certain things for like the number of slots we have to show responses and other stuff, which we use for the cleanup. But everything else here, all these things is valid answer, all those things were things we covered before. So we don't have to go through that. But let's just jump into the main loop, which is how we want to do the processing for all of this. And if you remember when we talked about this, the main loop basically starts up and initializes, then just sits in a loop in the background and constantly looks at different things based on what it's told through vMix you want to do. And the way we do that at its heart is through a dynamic value. So dynamic value 1 is telling us, okay, this is the functionality I want to do to accept responses from people. And that's what we covered in the last show. And dynamic value 2 displays those responses grouped by answer. Again, we covered that in the last show. So that piece hasn't changed, this sort of module, dynamic value 1 indicating, what one of those functions we want to execute. The thing that we've added for this show is we've added dynamic value 2 to indicate which question we actually want to show to our audience. And so what we're doing here, so let's sort of go through, all the stuff is really the same. We initialize everything up front. We now come back and say, okay, now this while true is our main processing loop. And as always, every time we go through, we read the vMix and make sure we get the latest values from vMix on where things are set. And the first thing we do is we read the dynamic values. And so we're checking dynamic value 2 to start. This is giving us functionality. But the next thing we're going to do, now that we have this, is we're going to start to process the questions. To just say, do we have a good question loaded? And the way we do this is we first come back and say, is there a value in dynamic value 2? So we start there. And then we go out and say, we're going to assume if there is a value, that's the question that we want. And we're going to hand that over to our load question function. And if you remember, that was in our question handler module. So as opposed to calling it directly, the way we do this type of call when we've modularized everything is we put the module name here, question handler, dot, and then the exported function name. So that's load question. And that's how we call this. So now if you remember all those checks we did, this is going to come back and say, if there isn't a question that corresponds or anything, it'll just return null. But if it's good, we'll get the right answer. And that's exactly what you see here. If desired question isn't null, which means we got something good, I go and I do all my processing. And so in that processing, we are basically updating a set of titles. So we're updating, we have a question title. So we have the first one is the vMix question title input number, which is where it is, which one of our titles we want, and the desired question that we want to update it with. That's all the JSON data for the current question, and the vMix URL. So we know how to tell vMix which vMix, if we are running multiple, we want to use to do this update. And so we have, if I actually switch back to the my vMix UI over here for a minute, there's a couple of things. So we have different titles now that handle the question. So when we talk about this is sort of the, well, let me start over here. This is the main title that we have for showing questions. Over here, if I want to show questions and responders, all we've done, and this is nothing big deal to look at here, but all we've done in layers is we've taken and we've put this question on top of where the title that we're painting all the responders in. So this lets me split the screen and position that. So that's just a simple thing we're doing to update the question. And we also have a studio based display, which would be for the host in the studio. And this is going out output too. So if I change questions, the host in the studio would be able to see the change in question and know in advance what we're going to be asking in the next question. And then, anything I do when I put this up, they will know exactly, this is the question that was coming up. And then as soon as they display that, all that information will be displayed. So these are the titles that we've added now to work with questions. And that's really, pretty handy. The other thing though, because we set this up and we use in GT Title Designer the exact same names for all of the text fields, I actually, if you remember the title I had last time, which said all the people and what their responses were, I now can easily just update this with the title information by calling that update question title file, because I'm using the exact same name. So it's going to update the question up here and each of the responses shown associated with the different hash A to hash Ds. So again, very simple. And if we go back to the code here, you can see all I'm really doing now is I'm calling this update question title very, very simply. And all of that functionality in the background happens, and all of the things in vMix now are changed. So this keeps us up to date with all of the questions, and we make sure all of that's there. So the last thing, which is important here, is that we always check, we want to check the last question that was asked. And so when we start to do this initialization, we go in there and say, okay, assign this value, since it was a good question, assign that to the last question asked. And the reason we're doing that is if because this is a continuous loop, if the current question is the same as the last question, I don't have to go back and call and fetch a new question or new responses or any of that. So all I'm doing is saying, are we still on the same question, or have we changed to a new question and I have to do some more stuff? So this last question index, by storing that now, it's very easy for us inside this loop to come back and say, okay, do something to read a new question, or just stay where you are and don't do anything. And again, makes the processing load a bit easier. But at that point, all the things we wanted to do for this show with questions are really taken care of. And we come back and we do the same things. Dynamic value 1 collects all the responses like we did before. Dynamic value 1, if it equals to 2, that was equal to 1, dynamic value 1 equal 1. If dynamic value 1 equals 2, then we're going and we're updating the titles and displaying those responses. The other thing that we've added, though, since we're now starting to get ready to put this into a multiple question style model, is we've added dynamic value 3. And what this will do is it resets everything. So it's going to refresh all the titles, go in and say, let me make sure that all the responders, that everybody that responded to this past question, set that back to no, because we're going to have a new question. So when people make new responses, we want to be able to count them. So all we're doing when we set this to 3 is we flush everything out and get our process ready for the next question. Then we just sleep and go back and loop. So that's all the code that we really have to handle this piece. And again, you start to see now the way we're leveraging vMix values to drive the path through code. And the fact these are on separate systems doesn't matter. This can run on one box and vMix on another, and all would work perfectly well. And it gives the person running vMix standard push button control for what they want to have happen. Very important from a workflow point of view. They don't have to coordinate with somebody sort of doing the question operations. All of the question operations can be done right from a Stream Deck, like we were doing here for all of this. So, okay, I think we are pretty much done for today's show. We will have one more piece, part 3 in this series, that will cover all of the sort of wrap-up stuff. So if you want to say, okay, which was the correct answer, who got the answer correct, keep scores over the range of questions, sort of show a leaderboard for who's gotten the most questions right, all of that, that's what we're going to do in part 3 of this. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to switch over now to our post-show Hangout. I'll take care of a few more questions that we have here in the Hangout, and we'll be back in a moment. Take care, everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the post-show. So as you can see, we're starting to build this now into a more serious project. And there are a couple of things. So first, arrepiéntete. Hopefully I haven't... so yeah, Freddie Flores. I'm sorry. I got the name of this. So Freddie, thank you for joining us from Honduras. Great to have you here. So let's see. So this is really starting to now develop into a more complex project. So we have multiple modules that are all part of this. And these modules are running in Node.js on its own system. So I just saw Bill Mew came back and said, can you show how you'd load the code into vMix? The great part here, Bill, is that I don't have to do anything specific in vMix. I'm not loading any real code inside of vMix. The only things that I'm doing in vMix are setting dynamic values effectively, dynamic value 1 and dynamic value 2, so I can control the questions and I can control the processing flow. What we're doing for this is we're using something called Node.js. And I believe if you go to nodejs.org, I could have the URL wrong, but it's possible. You're able to download Node. It's a full development environment. And everything then runs basically in a command line. So if let's switch over to the uh, Visual Studio here so I can show a few things. What I have here, so I'm showing all this code, but what you're not really seeing here is I'm actually running the application right here in basically a command prompt in Windows. And so everything I do, so I'm just gonna click in here and stop this. So everything I'm doing here, I will just go and say node, and I run the quiz system here. This starts up, initializes everything, and it goes from there. So all of the things I'm running separate from vMix. And what's really powerful here, because if you remember, I put the vMix URI, like where is the vMix system I'm talking to? Okay, so we have you could have multiple vMix systems and say, I'm going to use this one to do the quiz show and do all the overlays, and I'm going to actually switch my cameras on another and just bring the output from one vMix system in as an overlay to the other. So very, very powerful way to do this, and lets you control things totally dynamically. The person doing the main switch could be directing the node system to do things, and the node system could be talking to a second vMix system to handle all the overlays. Incredibly flexible here. And that's part of the reason why I've been putting much more emphasis here. So let me just very quickly, we have Jan Bernat. So Jan.
Totally dynamically. The person doing the main switch.
Hello, hello.
Hello, Jan. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks you. I'm trying to connect to this show sometimes, but I have some issues with the webcams and virtual webcams, and sometimes I cannot choose any camera, but today I'm here.
Excellent. So good to have you here. So did you have any specific questions, or you just wanted to drop in and say hello?
No, I
Always
just want
welcome.
to drop in and look how these calling tools working for the audience, and how it's working, because it's different from the vMix and call, and from the Zoom and any other platform where you're connecting.
Yeah. So I mean, this is our live to air product. So and what we really focus on with this is how do you streamline sort of the interface. So like if you came in to connect with us, we could change cameras. So if you had multiple cameras, we could do things like that. So that makes it easier if somebody actually queues up and wants to connect, for us to sort through and handle everything from a connection point of view. But I think it sort of comes down to what we're doing in today's show too. So I appreciate you calling in. It really is all about interactivity. So everything that we want to do when you do live streaming is really engage your audience, get them involved. So that's one tool, sort of bringing people on and getting this type of dynamic interaction. That's one of the things we really like when we started out building live to air. We really wanted to focus on how can you do something where an audience unplanned could just call into a show, get screened, and get brought on air. So that's really cool. When we love having that, because everybody that we talk to, that has seen the show, we'd love to get to know more about you. So are you doing production work normally?
Yes, I do a lot of vMix call connections, and set up with the 16 connection and 32 connections. So sometimes really big events where many people connect via vMix call,
Yeah.
and also via Zoom or any platform is available. But I'm looking for any solutions to connecting. I think this live to air is a little pricey from my point of view, but I of course know that to write this code is really expensive thing. But I have some troubles with that tool, that specific tool, because it's not always connect because I try several times to connect to this show. And if I have some virtual camera or some cameras that doesn't work correctly, the show, the list of the cameras don't appear.
Okay,
I don't have.
actually, I can tell you specifically about that. So if you have a virtual webcam set up and the source that was feeding that webcam isn't on at the time you come in, Chrome or Edge or most browsers, they will basically wait and sort of time out and won't do anything else. And so now I think there's like a 30-second timeout that we were able to force in there to say if you get caught waiting for a virtual webcam that isn't there yet, you'd be able
Okay.
to pull this in. So that's definitely something. And we always welcome the feedback. We definitely try to make the experience as
Yes.
seamless as possible.
And second thing, when I connecting today, was that I see your colleague who connecting, but I didn't see the program feed, and I can't hear you. I have two PC, so I can connect with this PC, and I was listening to the YouTube on the second PC. But if I will wait a little more, it will be for me. It's better to see the program feed to can talk about what you just said.
Yep. So the way the system works is that when you first connect, that initial connection is through something called call-in manager, where you're just talking to the operator. If your connection is good and they would send you over to the studio, when you're off air, you would get the studio feed, just like you're seeing, with the live feed. Uh,
I was seeing whole time when I off air your colleague he
yep.
didn't
Right. So that's the
change.
way we set this up for this, because typically, we bring people on pretty quickly. And I appreciate, what you're saying.
Okay.
We may want to set up differently. But in the product itself, we have a separate on-air and a separate off-air feed, as well as the ability
Okay.
for an operator to jump in. So I think you just got moved from call-in manager then over to live to air, sort of on air. So you didn't have that sort of intermediary experience. And that's typically if you were doing a large event, that would give you the ability to send your program video to all your remote guests that are connecting before they actually go live, so they could
Yeah.
all talk with each other and sort of interact in a green room, which we've set up before, where you show the program and have everybody else visible that's waiting to go live, and then when you switch live, everybody sees the feed. So again, this is all good feedback, because we always are looking, especially for the way we have it set up in the show too. So that's we want to make sure we're doing that well, as sort of in a way that makes sense to you as well. So
Okay.
all right, Jen.
That's all from me. So thank you very much.
Oh,
And
thank you for calling in. We really appreciate it.
thanks.
Take care, Jen. Bye.
Bye.
Okay. So let me switch back. So we have Bill just asked another question. So let me sort of jump in. He's saying, if you run the code from the command prompt, then how do you start it? And then later, how do you stop it? So effectively, what we're doing here when we run it from the command prompt is we're just sort of setting this up on a system that would run inside of your studio. And in the command prompt, you start this up, it runs in the background, then you go back to that machine and you just go to the command prompt and Control C to stop it. You could have keys on the Stream Deck that would actually sit there and send a signal to the program to stop. And in fact, you could do things on the Stream Deck that could start up. So on a Stream Deck, you can run code on another computer. You can tell it to execute command prompts and stuff. So there are different ways you could do this with either native Stream Deck, things like Companion, things like Central Control. So multiple ways that you could handle this from a production point of view, if you wanted to have this start and stop. So the nice thing from this approach, though, is that it doesn't have to be running on your main switcher. So this is something that you could put on a secondary box and have this just run in the background in the studio and have somebody operationally, handle that. But like I said, a lot of this stuff could be done all through push buttons. So if you just have that computer up, then you can access it. You can send commands to it to start up and run the applications you want to run in different command prompts. So that should get you there. All right, so I think if there's any other questions, please get them in now. But this is sort of a good point to also talk about something to keep in mind when you're doing a quiz type program during a live show. And that is, your timing is going to be different from your audience timing. So when you stream out, you are probably anywhere from 10 seconds to 30 seconds, a typical stream, delayed by the time your audience sees you. So when you do things where you put up a question, when you put that question up, you have to figure the audience doesn't start to see that question until somewhere between 10 and 30 seconds based on the latency inside the stream. And so when you say, I want to close my quiz and stop it, that's going to give you something where you need to be aware and say, okay, I just don't want to put this up and close the quiz, in 30 seconds if they've just seen this thing. And, so you've got to be sort of aware of that time difference. And that's always why when I ask for final questions, I then sort of talk about something else to try to get this in, because it can take a while before you even hear me ask for final questions and respond. The comments are real time, so that's really good. But when people see the stream itself, that's going to be delayed. So something to keep in mind, you probably need to have somebody visually watching your live stream to know when the question appeared on the stream going out, and then sort of judge your timing based on that. All right. So Bill, thank you for joining us here. Everybody, John, Freddie, and Pino, thank you all for commenting here and being part of the show. We appreciate that. So we will see you all next week. Have a safe week. Try to stay cool if you're in some part of the world that is baking right now. So we know that's pretty tough on a lot of people, but be cool, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everyone.